What's going on, guys? We are back with episode 9 of the 0 to 3k series, where I will be documenting my journey of trying to pug completely solo on a brand new class and spec as a healer that I have never played before. To check out any episodes you may have missed from this series, here's a playlist you can click in the top right hand corner of your screen. If you haven't already, then be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. If you want to see some more of my content, then be sure to check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Newmen_TV, or click the link in the description for some WoW live streams of keys and mythic raiding, especially as we get closer to the War Within launch. Alright, time for our vault. Now, we do only have 2 vault slots, but that shouldn't be too big of a deal. Honestly, at this point, I think the best thing would probably be a myth track tier piece. Probably a chest piece, since we already have a socket in our helmet. But yeah, other than that, we might just be taking a socket this week. Okay, so we did get another myth track belt or a myth track cloak. Okay, so after doing some sims with questionably epic, I think I'm gonna go with this cloak. It is very close between a socket and the cloak, but I think overall it is probably worth it. And if we do get something next week that we aren't really wanting to take, then we can just always take the socket. So I think taking the upgrade here, even if it's a little bit worse than a socket, is probably worth it, since we still have next week. And our key is a +12 Neltheris. After doing some sims, I realized that for the time being, without upgrading this new cloak, it seems to be more beneficial to stick with our current one. But I do think that the free upgrades this provides is still worth it, since the socket is always available for us to take. I decided to spend my crests and flight stones on my cloak, gloves, and my belt. Put some socket into my necklace, since we have a hero track one now with some pretty good stats. Since I was already at the auction house, I decided to buy some more consumables, so now we will hopefully have enough files, runes, and food, hopefully for the rest of the series, but this is basically to be determined by how many keys we end up depleting. Our first key was a +11 Algathar Academy. We started with lusting the big pull at the tree boss. Pull went solid, and overall this key was pretty good. We had good coordination, interrupts, and this allowed me to focus a bit more on my damage. With it being tyrannical on Croth, I wanted to see if we could push the amount of screeches we could survive, so that we aren't doing a significant part of the fight with both the fire swirlies and the winds. We survived 4 stacks before incurring the first mechanic, and killed it with relative ease. A few deaths to Veximus, which is the hardest boss in my opinion, because as the fight goes on, it gets harder and harder, and lots of DPS players will use their defensives a little too early, and then have nothing for the later stages, which tend to be the scariest with a bunch of overlap. We ended up getting 12 score after just barely missing the 2 chests. Our next key, a +11 Neltheris, had a pretty cool guest. If you are somebody who keeps an eye on the Raider.io leaderboard or watched the TGP Cup A, then you might recognize Fu, who was the Shadow Priest in this key. I was pretty surprised when I joined and I recognized his name, since this is a pretty low key relative to what he usually does, but I'm not going to complain. For any aspiring preservation evokers, I would be very cautious in these pulls following Magma Tusk. While you do have Cauterizing Flame to dispel the dot, there will always be more than you can dispel, and while this group was good with using their defensives, if they got the dot, this usually isn't the case. The pulls after Chargath are not as bad, but there's definitely some aggro issues, since tanks will run ahead and try to tag mobs, but my healing will start to generate enough aggro to pull threat, so it's very important to be careful, since I have died here countless times. Dragonbone Axe is a spell that lots of players will ignore, since it seems insignificant, but especially on certain pulls this can be really dangerous, so I like to make sure that I have my tail whip ready to stop it, since on Tyrannical Week at this key level You only need to stop it once to be safe for the rest of the pull. I made sure to Zephyr the AoE from the bird, and we started the last boss. Another use for Cauterizing Flame is on the last boss to remove the curse when you pick up an item to use to break the shield from this boss. 31 score and a 2 chest. I do wish this was a 12 or a 13 since this group was very coordinated and I think we could have timed a harder key. Our next key was a plus 11 Uldamon. A letdown wouldn't really describe how this went. It started with our tank falling over when they combined pulls with no cooldowns left. They did have a dot on them that I could have removed, but the rest of the group was taking damage and I thought their self-sustain would be enough, combined with assuming that they would use their cooldowns, but they didn't end up doing that. We managed to live Bromac, but had 2 deaths on the dwarves surprisingly. I then made a very silly mistake where I Verdant Embraced into a fire beam, basically on pull of Emberon, and there isn't really a good way to reset that boss, so we did wipe. We started to make more and more foolish mistakes, like pulling with little to no organization or plan since we were behind, and I think we just threw caution to the wind. Like here, we had no answer for the LOS mechanics with the golems, and with nearly 20 deaths, our timer had basically run out. But since we were so far into the dungeon, I really hoped that we would finish it anyway. But our tank got barely just out of range of my Dream Breath here, and with Argent Defender and Bubble available, he ended up dying. He said question mark, and left. Our next key was a plus 12 Brackenhide Hollow. This key wasn't very eventful early on, few deaths to some swirlies or bad positioning, but we managed to make it to Treemouth before we ran into some issues, where we ended up losing a good chunk of time. After our tank came out of the Vine ability that consumes the tank, he had the frontal aimed at me, the Warlock, and the Monk. I managed to hover out of the way at the last second, but when combined with an early death from our warrior, we ended up running out of battle reses, and this led to a much longer boss fight than it should have been. Since we had a few DPS down, it just ended up taking a little bit too long. Luckily, since we played well enough in the earlier parts of the dungeon, it didn't end up being too big of a deal, but we did have to wait around a bit for the skip on Stink Breath, just with the way that the pathing was working. Before we had a couple deaths on Gut Shot from getting fixated by the hyenas, which even I fell victim to. We did still time the key, just barely for 18 score. Our next one was a plus 12 Uldamon that didn't actually make it past Bromac because of the totem living significantly longer than usual. With Lust, the first few totems would die in time, but once it ran out, we didn't really have the damage to stay on top of it. I certainly could have played better, but a few more defensives from our DPS players surely would have made a world of difference as well. We also had some pretty high uptime on the Geomancer ads when they were casting, which I tried to kick as much as possible, but with a 40-second cooldown on my kick, it wasn't nearly enough to protect us from all the casts going off. Trust me though, it gets worse. If you thought that key was fast, then just wait. This key seemed promising as we actually talked about doing the big first pull before we even started the dungeon. I used my first stop on the flowers when they were casting, but our Demon Hunter didn't really seem to use any cooldowns or defensives really for such a big pull and instantly dies to the frontal. We had no follow-up stops once he respawned, so the flowers casted and we had another tank death, and just like that the paladin left and it was over. Our final key of the week was a plus 10 Uldamon. Lower key than I would have liked, but this can happen fairly often, especially as we get later into the week. It just gets harder to do higher and higher keys, and keys like this are a good stepping stone so that even if they aren't the final key you do for the season to reach whatever your goal is, it can still allow you to more easily get into the groups that will be your final keys for the season. I already talked about the earlier bosses a few times so far, so let's skip to after we killed Emberon. We had much better placement of the mobs that make sense to LOS, like the golems and the dwarfs that do the hail of stone. We did, however, almost wipe to this pull when we let 2 Curse of Stone casts go off. I believe something happened here, but I'm not quite sure what. Maybe I wasn't supposed to dispel what I did. I thought that the Curse of the Stone cast would stun a player and put a swirly under them, which is why I dispelled this since I thought I was supposed to. But maybe we were too close together, or maybe that's a different spell. I'm not too sure. Luckily, we still got the 2 chests and another portal to add to the collection. We got 13 score and ended off the week at 2702. We got 2 vault slots from M+, which is all we need, since it means we have secured our socket for next week if we need. I'm going to end off today's episode. Thank you guys for watching. If there's any content you guys want to see other than pugging challenges, especially as we get closer and closer to the War Within, be sure to let me know in the comments and make sure to subscribe. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time.